much. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers for today, Tim Shaw and Jane Parpart. Both are leading figures in African studies, development studies, international relations, gender studies, the whole series of areas of domains of expertise. As some of you may know, both Tim and Jane were professors for a number of years, if not decades, at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And then Tim went to University of London heading Commonwealth Studies, and then both Tim and Jane went down to University of West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. To kind of our delight, not sure if it's to their delight, but they're with us here in Ottawa now. They've moved to Ottawa, so we see Tim and Jane around more often, participating in their events. Jane is actually teaching a couple courses, graduate courses here at Carleton University in the Institute of Political Economy, and we hope to draw on their participation expertise for some years to come. I'm also personally delighted to have Tim and Jane here, since my first introduction to Africa was 15 years ago on a World University Service of Canada seminar. Some of you may know World University Service of Canada, which is a non-governmental organization based here in Ottawa, do a variety of things in terms of development, including bringing refugee students to campuses in Canada. But they also sponsor seminars in development in different third world countries. Back in 1987, it was in Zimbabwe, and I was a very naive student at University of Manitoba who, on a whim, almost applied to go to this development seminar in Zimbabwe. And lo and behold, for some reason, I was selected. And at that point, they had 3 professors leading the 30 Canadian students, and one of the professors was this professor from a place called Dalhousie University, Tim Shaw. So I got to know Tim quite well then. And for better or for worse, he helped introduce me to Africa. And then Jane, I've gotten to know more and more, particular common interest in Zimbabwe. So I'm going to turn the floor over to them, and we'll probably go talk collectively for about 45 or so minutes, and we'll have discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Blair. Good evening. Very nice to be here, and many thanks to Blair and Annette for making this possible. I'm actually on my way back to Aalborg for much of next term, so I'm very pleased that we could do this. Before that, and I should indicate that we don't usually either present together or go to each other's presentations, so if Jane starts disagreeing, you'll understand she doesn't often get that opportunity. We're particularly pleased, and again, it was my co-editors who invited Jane to contribute to my book, not me. We're particularly pleased to be christening our new book on African international relations. I particularly want to talk about the conclusion, because the first chapter and the table of contents is on the Palgrave website. And it's particularly nice for me to be back at Carleton, even before the Zimbabwean seminar, courtesy of Doug Anglin. I was brought here to learn how to be a proper faculty member and Africanist at Carleton, and then went off to Nigeria as a properly christened, socialized Carleton faculty member for a year. And certainly back in both London and Trinidad have learned a lot about transnational communities, cultures, networks that certainly influences part of this book in terms of the rise of the global south. So my theme particularly is that the world of development and the world of political economy is in flux. I think that perhaps one sees that or feels that less in Canada than in other parts of the world. And certainly the book series, and I brought a few copies of the flyer, is symptomatic, because when I started this, again 20 years or so ago, to have an IPE series that focused on the global south was thought of as rather risque. But now that the global south includes the BRICS, we can discuss whether it's 4 or 5, certainly the global south has, in a sense, come back, and next year we're hoping to have 25 titles, which is a record, and I think that that, in a sense, is symptomatic of the way the world is changing. I did a book with one of my graduates, one of my alums from Dalhousie, Kevin Dunn, on African IR 10 years ago. But I think that since then, Africa has become much more a part of the global mainstream than it was. And I particularly want to emphasize the potential on the continent for developmental states, as does the latest UN Economic Commission for Africa report, and The Economist talking now, as it apologizes for talking about hopeless, how Africa is now hopeful and rising, etc. And to that extent, I think that therefore African contributions to both development, international relations, IPE, are increasingly recognized along with those of the other parts of the global south, Asia, Latin America, etc. And so the contributions of those regions to the volume by, say, Tickner and Weber on comparative IR, or Nicola Phillip and Weaver on comparative IPE, are in a sense less controversial or less unusual than they have been before. On the other hand, of course, there are still fragile and failed states on the continent, and so in a sense there's a very interesting dichotomy, and we can debate whether regional relations, regional structures help to absorb some of those differences or not. I particularly want to talk about 3 or 4 sets of issues that I think inform international relations, IPE development, and then we'll just quickly go through some of the African contributions. Firstly, the whole question of varieties of capitalisms and varieties of companies. And it does seem to be very important that we recognize that obviously the BRICS, but also South Africa, may offer distinctive forms of capital, technology, labor, market relations than the traditional North Atlantic, with of course the traditional North Atlantic being much more affected by the crisis thus far than the global south. Secondly, I think there's a very interesting, and some of this gets a little academic, but I think there's a very interesting debate emerging about emerging markets, the BRICS, emerging economies, emerging states, regional powers, emerging classes, emerging societies, etc., and the degree to which those overlap or are different from each other. Thirdly, as I've already suggested, questions of new regionalisms. That I think the continent offers interesting examples of innovative forms of regional relations, particularly at a time when obviously the EU of the Eurozone, the PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, is going through all sorts of difficulties. And so the regional rebalancing, restructuring, the degree to which Africa is under pressure to sign economic partnership agreements or not, unlike the Caribbean, is, I think, an important issue. And finally, questions of transnationalisms. And one of the things that obviously has changed in Ottawa since I last lived here is that global Africa is much more present in Ottawa, or at least it seems to be when you look at Blair's endless weekly social events, than it was previously. So when you go back to Cohane and Nye, remembering that actually Joe Nye started his work in international relations on East Africa, even before I was in East Africa, and then proceed fast forward to the work, the handbook on transnationalism from Held and Hale, and also look particularly at the work of Sanjeev Kagram on dams and development, the role of the World Commission on Dams, which was headquartered in South Africa, and was the only one to really include multinational companies and NGOs as well as states. It seems to me that there are a variety of contributions that we can identify. So The Economist, as part of its mea culpa, has suggested that, quote, over the next 5 years, the average African economy will outpace its Asian counterpart. Africa's economy will grow at an average annual rate of 7% over the next 20 years, slightly faster than China's. Africa's changing fortunes have largely been driven by China's surging demand, but other factors have also counted, The Economist has said. And similarly, the World Bank has suggested that, quote, sub-Saharan Africa in 2011 has an unprecedented opportunity for transformation and sustained growth. Until the outset of the global economic crisis, economic growth had averaged 5% a year for a decade. And I'd like to particularly look at three factors that I think Africa is contributing to the world of international relations. Firstly, and this is particularly important and reflects the rise of the BRICS, but also the rise of the rest that has recently been encouraged by Zakaria, Kana, etc. The varieties of innovative sources of finance, particularly in response to the decline of the OECD DAC, comes out of a variety of networks, including the leading group, and reflects the work of Patrick de Velterre and Tom de Bruyn on what they call the fourth pillar, emerging in the worlds of development, of non-traditional and often non-state organizations, migrants, new private foundations, social movements, celebrities, etc. And I would just identify two or three varieties of these encouraged by the Gates Foundation, also by the Blair Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, but also the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And these join, of course, a variety of faith-based organizations that are more established, like the Aga Khan Foundation, Catholic Relief Services, Lutheran World Relief, etc. Firstly, the Global Solidarity Fund for Global Public Goods. Secondly, the currency transaction tax. Those of you with memories that are longer than Blair's will remember the G8 in Halifax, the Tobin tax, the Halifax Initiative, and that has gradually continued to come through policy networks so that the EU is actually proposing a tax on financial flows amongst its members despite the euro crisis. Thirdly, the airline ticket levy, again implemented particularly by Spain and Korea, with the resources going to ATM vaccines in association with the Clinton and Gates Foundation. Fourthly, the carbon taxes trading system coming out of the IPCC, the COP15, and then more recently the COP17. The Global Economic or Environmental Facility from the World Bank, etc. And of course controls on money laundering and the possibility of taxes on the continuing very high level of remittance flows, all in addition, of course, to sovereign wealth funds, etc. Secondly, as I already suggested, varieties of new regionalism. Africa, of course, is a continent of over 50 states, now including South Sudan as well as Eritrea, has a significant number of landlocked countries, and those tend to be, if you like, at the core of many of the regional networks. But certainly for somebody who paid taxes to the East African community back in the 60s, when it was a community of 3, now the East African community of 5, possibly 6 if it includes South Sudan, with a much broader mandate, including civil society, including security, including parliamentary dimensions, than back in the 1950s and 1960s. Similarly, overlapping with that, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, an attempt to, in a sense, do a Kimberley process for a variety of commodities at the regional level, particularly things like coltan that are so important in cell phones and high-tech equipment. And I think, as I'll suggest in a minute, there has been a growth coming out of these networks of attempts to establish natural resources charters, the Diamond Development Initiative based in Ottawa, likewise the Devonshire Initiative, and recently in Addis, the African Mining Vision. Secondly, of course, there have been the expansion of a variety of meso and micro level regions in the continent, as well as more macro, with Africa contributing particularly development corridors and peace parks, particularly in southern Africa, the Maputo corridor, but also others, but also trans-frontier parks on the borders of South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, but also up to Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, etc. And as I've already suggested, the important role of the World Commission on Dams in terms of a southern-based and more inclusive international commission. Thirdly, obviously, questions of climate change, which are of particular importance in Africa, with COP15 in Durban being very different from COP17 in Durban being very different from COP15 in Copenhagen, and the development of the BASIC group as well as the IPSA group as, in a sense, foundations of the BRICS. But fourthly, plugging back into the whole question of the changing global environment, changing patterns of interregional relations, with obviously African regions increasingly networking, connecting to the BRICS, particularly India and China, as well as historically with Japan. Fifth, obviously, because of the landlocked states, a growth of informal sector exchanges at the regional level, some of which are illegal as well as legal, involving people as well as goods, and increasingly things like cell phone networks serving to reinforce some of these regional patterns. And finally, Nollywood, the growth of African cultural production and exchange to parallel that of Bollywood. The penultimate point I want to make is about the way in which a variety of forms of private or transnational governance have evolved on the continent with importance at the global level. Obviously, the most important, the icon of this is the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and the Ottawa Process, the Kimberley Process on Conflict Diamonds, encouraged by Partnership Africa-Canada, as well as Global Witness, and now leading to the Diamond Development Initiative and the International Conference on the Great Lakes. But there are many others around forestry, around fisheries, etc. But also there are areas that still remain inadequately governed, such as the small arms curse, such as violence against women and children, despite continued organization. And finally, an insight coming particularly from Central America and the Caribbean, the evolution out of ideas around human development and human security towards citizen security because of the growth of violence, guns, drugs, etc. This then leads me, perhaps in a slightly over-optimistic New Year atmosphere, to cite from a recent article in Foreign Policy by Dorr, Lund, and Roxburgh, quote, "Africa has outgrown the gloom and doom. Africa is now one of the fastest growing regions. Revenue from natural resources, the old foundation of African economies, directly accounted for just 24% of growth during the last decade. The rest came from other booming sectors such as finance, retail, agriculture, telecommunications, etc." So to go back to my early comments about developmental versus fragile states, varieties of capitalism, emerging markets and donors, the rise of the BRICS, it seems to me that the continent has a lot to contribute, but we also have to recognize the continued difficulties around fragile or failed states and the growing conflicts over land, water, and other resources that climate change might yet intensify. Finally, though, let me just cite from Peterson, from Jan Nedeveen Peterson, in a recent issue of Development and Change, because he suggests that, in a sense, there is an overarching evolution underway that these particular African and other dimensions contribute to. Peterson has recently suggested that, quote, "The rise of emerging societies," he's a sociologist rather than an economist, is a major turn in globalization and holds significant emancipatory potential. North-South relations have been dominant for 200 years, and now an East-South turn is taking shape. The 2008 economic crisis is part, Peterson suggests, of a global rebalancing, or we might argue, restructuring process. So the book that I just edited with Fantuciro and Scarlett Cornelison attempts to contribute to some of these evolving analyses and directions, and we were very pleased that a variety of contributors could join us, including Jane and Lisa Thompson on questions of conflict, gender and masculinity.
I'm going to stand up, I think, a little bit wrong, I think, at least at this time of day. Tim is right that it was Scarlett Cornelison who tried to talk me into doing the chapter on gender, and basically the book is asking the question: what can the African case or cases say to international relations issues, particularly theorizing around international relations? And being not an IR specialist myself, I was a little bit leery of this, but I have written on women and the state and gender in the state, and I realized that 10 years before this new version was published, it was, as Tim said, Kevin Dunn and Tim produced an initial, very well-regarded book asking the same question. So it's interesting that he came back, and it's also interesting that there was no discussion of gender in the first book. So I felt I really must take this on, and because I have been writing for years about the importance of gender in international relations and from the international to the local. And I also, at first I was thinking, well, I should just take on the whole of IR, and it was just too big and sort of out of control. It could be everything and anything. And then Scarlett suggested, why didn't I take on the part of international relations that is the most deeply imbued with a kind of masculinist, ungendered, unconscious masculinist and ungendered approach to the world, which is basically the study of security and conflict and war. And so, indeed, as I looked at some of the literature coming out of IR, the African Guerrillas book by Chris Clapham, the Morton Boas book, the Kevin Dunn and Morton Boas book, there's a huge literature, the William Reno, there's a huge literature on conflict in Africa and insecurity. It's one of the major arguments and preoccupations in terms of the continent. I just did the first order of looking through the table of contents, looking through the index, and it's amazing. There would be whole books on conflict, all about conflict, including rapes and God knows what else, all kinds of gender-based violence as well as other violence, and yet you go to the index and there would be nothing under R for rapes, nothing under gender-based violence, nothing under men, nothing under masculinity, nothing really much under women, very little. And yet, when you look at the way in which conflict has played out and insecurity and security have played out in the continent, I felt that gender had a huge role to play. So I'm going to put forward my argument, and we'll see whether I convince you. The most classical approach to theorizing about security and insecurity and war is, of course, the state-centered approach, where wars are seen as something that are between states. And security is seen as something that is established for us as individuals by the state we live in. And if we're in a state that is not good at doing this, we're more insecure. And when we feel insecure, the state is supposed to improve and help us to become more secure. Now, I think the African case raises some very serious questions about the limitations of this kind of approach to security. For example, many, many states after the national struggles have established women's machineries, laws to improve the condition of women. The Age of Majority Act in Zimbabwe, for instance, which provided women with the legal status as majority at the age of 18, which did not exist before that. And so there's a lot of bureaucratic and legal structures put in place that look good and look like we were moving forward, and yet gender-based violence has continued to be an enormous problem. South Africa, for instance, has the third highest percentage of women in parliament in the world. Rwanda has the first. Yet South Africa also has about the highest, one of the highest rape rates in the world. So that if the state is the place to solve all these problems, then it's not doing a very good job. If we look even at regional organizations such as the African Union and SADC, we find claims to bring in gender, but when you look at what they're actually doing, they're mainly spending their time worrying about regional security, military security, and gender-based violence, again, falls off the table. It's not seen as a regional security issue. Policies to empower women often undermine agency. By state policies often claim they're helping women, but they categorize them as part of the vulnerable group. You know, there's the disabled, youth, and women, as if they were all this same kind of helpless group that need to be given some little bits of help. So there's very little in that allows you to understand the agency of women and the fact that many women and many poor men, in fact, despite all the problems they're facing, are establishing ways of creating their own security outside of the state. They're developing, civic organizations and cooperations, local cooperations outside the state. And then in the most unhappy example, of course, some governments have even directed violence against women and gender-based violence, particularly rape of women in the Rwandan genocide. And for instance, ZANU in Zimbabwe has systematically supported the Green Bombers, who are the youth wing of the government, of the majority government, and have encouraged them to rape women and attack women and even murder women who are members of the opposition. So that the state, it seems to me that the African case is a very strong critique of the state as the primary support structure for security. And that raises very important questions, I think, for IR theory that just seems to stop there. Then the next area that I want to look at is the new wars. You know, when we had the end of the Cold War, there was this belief in the peace dividend. We were supposed to be moving into an era in the 1990s where there would be widespread peace, where the Soviet bloc had fallen, and there was going to be, there was no more reason for war because war was seen as something that was the result of Cold War politics, very much. Yet we actually wound up having a dramatic increase in not so much in interstate wars, but in intrastate wars, in civil wars, what have been labeled the new wars, and which have been seen as being marked particularly by greed and grievances as their most important driving factors. And there's a lot of literature on this, particularly Mary Kaldor, Mark Duffield, writing about the role of greed and grievance as a spur to these new wars. But it's very interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen the pictures of the guerrilla, the young men in the back of pickups with their cool glasses and their khaki gear and their AK-47, looking the picture of Rambo masculinity. And indeed, these young men are the foot soldiers of these wars, because these wars have been, because the pickup trucks and the young soldiers are reasonably cheap, and thus they become the logical people to to participate in these wars. But if we assume that they're only doing that for greed and grievance, I think that we have missed something that I think is very important, which is the role of masculinities in and the search for adult manhood and a place in the community. That is also, I'm arguing, a driving force that needs to be incorporated into the analysis of the new wars. And the reason I'm saying this is that, for instance, the work of Chris Dolan in the northern Ugandan struggles, he realized that he spent quite a bit of time up in the north, and he realized that the traditional paths to adult manhood had actually been pretty much destroyed by this kind of the war. The war was, destroying everything in its path. And one of the things he realized that these young men were achieving by picking up a rifle and joining the guerrilla forces and becoming one of the warriors in the new wars was that they were finding an alternative way to gain respect, access to money, to even if it was based on fear, sometimes access to sex, and so that he argued that indeed also that the sexual violence in a lot of these wars, with the widespread use of rape, especially of civilians, he argued that this was often a performance of masculinity, where young men would, in a group rape, they would be really performing sex to prove their manhood to the young men who were watching them. And in fact, in these wars, group rape is much more widespread than individual cases. There's some very important data emerging out of the Congo, in particular by Erica Bass and Maria Stern, who've been interviewing young soldiers, government soldiers for the most part, in the Congo. Maria Erickson Bass is, in fact, grew up in the Congo and is fluent in Lingala, and so she's been interviewing them in their normal local language. And what they've discovered there is that even though there are young women in these forces, and in fact some of the young women sort of claimed that they were more manly and more masculine and more ferocious than the men, that she discovered, so that they are taking on a kind of masculine role. That the men, while they recognized that these women were very good soldiers and were very tough and maybe a little frightening, they were also seen as materialistic. There was a good deal of tension around that suggested that these women soldiers, who were often seen as very materialistic and somewhat treacherous, and it didn't appear from their data, they have discovered that it does not seem that there was a big sort of development of a more tolerant approach to issues around gender relations between men and women, despite having young women in these forces. And indeed, all across the continent, when women soldiers have been decommissioned, they have very often just been told to go home to your village. But when they get there, they're often seen as like having had experiences that would be a bad influence on other people, like nice young women and nice young men, and they were often almost routinely been sent away and have gone to the cities to survive, often in very harsh conditions. So that what I'm arguing is that to understand the new world, we have to understand gendered practices, particularly the role of masculinities, in order to understand what people are experiencing, how they're understanding it, and the kind of ways that, in fact, a kind of militant hypermasculinity may be evolving out of such struggles. Then finally, there's the issue of human security and critical security studies. Human security has, am I running out of time? Okay, the argument of human security, which was put forward by the development report, the UNDP development report in 1994, was basically, I think, one that all of us can sympathize with. It's arguing that no, we cannot just look at the state, that people are insecure, we are all insecure if only one person fears for their life or fears that they will go hungry. In other words, they were saying that individuals and individuals' sense of security, both freedom from want and freedom from fear, are necessary. We must solve that problem for all individuals, or we cannot really speak of having a secure world. Now this brought the individual and individual insecurity into the center of the argument, including the potential for understanding insecurity in terms of violence in the family. I mean, like our case in Kingston that's been working its way through the court. The issue of honor killings. You can have people who are perfectly well fed, but they are frightened for their lives. You can also have people who are perfectly secure in terms of their life, but are worried about dying from hunger. So but the critique of human security has been that, okay, if this is the case, then how do we determine which is more important? And if everything's a security risk, then maybe nothing's a security risk. And so the critical security study started saying that we have to determine collective threats. We can't just talk about individual threats. We have to find out what is a collective threat. And particularly the Copenhagen School of Critical Security Studies argued that you need to go to expert voices who can tell you, as experts, what the collective threats are facing a nation. And so they would think about going to bureaucrats and going to think tanks and going to university professors and going to the media. But there's a very important feminist critique of this, where Lene Hansen from Copenhagen argued that the only problem with this kind of approach is that if you're going to experts, then who is being left out? Are there security threats that the experts are not apt to see? And aren't they the kind of threats that are mainly experienced by the very poor, or the vulnerable, those who don't have access to established corridors of power and power over thinking, as well as power in governments? And so she argues, in fact, that security around for the poor, and particularly for many women, is an arena that tends not to be seen as a collective threat. And so I took this and tried to use this approach in thinking about the issue of gender-based violence in southern Africa, where it has been. That's just one. You could use the Congo, you could use other areas. But, I mean, as I said earlier, South Africa has one of the highest gender-based violence rates in the world, especially the rape rate. This whole area, in fact, the whole region of southern Africa has but particularly South Africa, I think, and Zimbabwe, have a very serious problem around gender-based violence. But it is an issue that has been resisted by the government and by a lot of different voices and people in terms of addressing it as a serious collective threat. And my argument is that, because some people say, oh, it's just the kind of thing that certain groups experience. But the issue about rape is that even if you're not likely to experience it, if you know that it's happening regularly and in unexpected ways you can't control, then it means that every single woman and man who fears rape has to constantly watch where they're going, secure. In other words, they feel insecure. It's an insecurity that is very broadly experienced. Even the richest people in South Africa are not free of this fear. It is very widely held. This is true in many other parts of the world. I'm not trying to pick out Southern Africa worse than many other areas. Having just lived in Trinidad, it's a very similar situation where there's such high levels of violence that that everyone, even the head of the army, has to constantly worry about whether they're safe, because there's such a high, in fact, for instance, Jamaica, Belize, Trinidad have murder rates almost at the same level as South Africa. Yet it's seen as the Caribbean place where you should go and relax, but if you live there, you know better. And I think that one of the things that convinced me to make this argument is Scarlett Cornelissen herself, who comes from the Cape Flats in Cape Town, told me that in the community she grew up in, and still today, in the colored community, any woman walking alone after 6:30 at night is regarded as asking for rape. And she said that is just very widespread, and she doesn't see any way to change it. So my argument is that in terms of security, if we're going to talk about human security, we need the Southern African case around gender-based violence, particularly rape, is a very good and important example of the importance of looking at beyond established specialists in charge of saying what is a collective security threat, to widen the analysis and to bring in issues around gender and also poverty and possibly race and other sexuality, other issues. But that a collective security risk is often not heard if it is a gendered risk. And so I think the Southern African example, for me, is a very, very important support for the argument that Lene Hansen is making, and call an important affirmation of the critical importance of her critique of the limits of the human security model. So I hope I've convinced you a little bit that this is at least an argument that can be made.
Thanks very much, Jane and Tim.